It is the 3rd of March, 1944, in a stone barn outside the village of Mayssac in the Couriers region of central France. Rain is coming down hard on the slate roof, and inside, by the light of a single hurricane lamp, 5 men in mismatched coats and hunting jackets are sitting in a rough circle. In the middle of that circle, on an upturned crate, sits a boy of 16. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Marcel. His hands are tied loosely at the wrist. Nobody has hit him yet. That is almost worse. Marcel has been a courier for this Maquis cell for 4 months, carrying folded scraps of paper sewn into the lining of his jacket, memorizing addresses, cycling 20, 30, sometimes 50 kilometers a day along roads patrolled by men who would shoot him without a second thought if they searched him properly. Tonight, he has been accused of something far more dangerous than being caught. He has been accused of being the reason 3 men from a neighboring cell were arrested 11 days ago. Someone talked. The finger is pointing at the boy on the crate. In the corner of the barn, half hidden by a hay bale, is a Sten gun, cleaned and ready, that one of the 5 men has already picked up twice tonight and put down again. This is not cinema. This is what happened, in one form or another, in barns and cellars and back rooms across occupied France, more times than any single archive can confirm. Resistance networks did not have courts, they did not have lawyers or judges or the luxury of a fair trial with an appeal. They had suspicion, fear, and a war that killed the slow to decide. This is why this story matters, not because it is unique, but because it was not. The French Resistance is remembered, quite rightly, for its saboteurs and its radio operators, its daring raids and its coded messages smuggled past Gestapo checkpoints. What is remembered far less often is the machinery of suspicion that ran alongside it, the interrogations conducted not by the enemy, but by exhausted, frightened men trying to protect their own, who sometimes got it catastrophically wrong. Somewhere in occupied France, a resistance cell came within minutes of executing one of their own most valuable couriers. He was 16 years old, and the story of how he survived the night says as much about the resistance as any act of sabotage ever did. The rain does not stop. Nobody in that barn is enjoying this. And in less than an hour, 5 armed, terrified men are going to have to decide whether to kill a boy who has done nothing wrong, or whether they have just been fed exactly the kind of story the Gestapo wanted them to believe.
By the winter of 1943 into 1944, the French resistance had a problem that had nothing to do with weapons or explosives and everything to do with trust. The Gestapo and the Vichy milice had become expert at a particular kind of psychological warfare. Rather than simply hunting resistance cells directly, which was slow and dangerous work, they had learned it was often easier to let the resistance destroy itself. The method was simple and devastatingly effective. A captured agent, under torture or under the promise of leniency, would be persuaded to plant a rumor rather than a full confession, a suggestion dropped in the right ear that a particular courier or radio operator was working for the other side. Sometimes it was true. Increasingly, as 1943 wore on, it was a deliberate lie, engineered specifically to trigger exactly the kind of internal panic that a barn interrogation represents. Historians who have studied the internal discipline of French resistance networks estimate that a meaningful proportion of resistance-on-resistance executions during the occupation were the result of this kind of manufactured suspicion rather than genuine verified betrayal, though because so few written records survive from cells that operated deliberately without paperwork, exact figures remain, and likely always will remain, impossible to pin down with confidence. The problem was structural, not just emotional. A resistance cell had almost none of the tools a real intelligence service would use to verify loyalty. There was no central database, no background check, no forensic accounting of a courier's movements. Verification depended entirely on networks of personal vouching, a chain of people who knew people, stretching back to whoever had first recruited a given agent. And that chain broke down constantly, especially for the youngest recruits, who were often used precisely because they attracted less suspicion from German patrols and had the fewest personal connections a cell leader could check. Teenagers made ideal couriers for exactly this reason. A boy of 15 or 16 on a bicycle delivering what looked like a loaf of bread or a parcel of laundry drew far less attention at a checkpoint than an adult man of fighting age. Some estimates drawn from post-war testimony suggest that couriers under 18 made up a disproportionate share of the message-carrying work in rural Maquis networks by 1944, precisely because the Germans had grown suspicious of young and middle-aged men traveling the roads. But that same quality, being unremarkable, being new to the network, having thin personal connections that could vouch for them, made young couriers the easiest people to suspect when something went wrong. They were, in the cruelest possible sense, both the most useful and the most disposable members of any cell, right up until the moment a network needed someone to blame. Add to this the sheer psychological weight the resistance carried by early 1944. Arrests in the couriers and neighboring departments had spiked sharply since the previous autumn. Cells that had operated for a year or more without a single loss were suddenly losing 2, 3, 4 men in a matter of weeks, and every loss triggered the same desperate question: who talked? In an environment with no reliable way to answer that question and every incentive to answer it quickly, the wrong person could, and sometimes was, accused, tried in the space of a single terrified evening, and shot before dawn. This is the world Marcel cycled into on the night of the 3rd of March.
The nearest thing a Maquis cell had to a rulebook for handling exactly this situation came, unofficially, from the training and operating procedures passed down, sometimes at second or third hand, from the Special Operations Executive, the British organization that had been parachuting agents, weapons, and radio operators into France since 1941. SOE-trained circuit leaders and the French officers who worked alongside them tried to instill at least the rudiments of proper counterintelligence discipline into the local Maquis groups they supplied. The idea of a cutout, a go-between, who never knew more than one link in the chain either side of them. The practice of using recognition codes, a specific phrase or object that confirmed a courier was who they claimed to be. And, crucially, the principle that no single unverified accusation should be enough to condemn someone without at least attempting to trace it back to its source. In practice, in a cold barn at 11 o'clock at night with a lamp running low on paraffin, these principles were far easier to write down in a London training manual than to apply. The 5 men questioning Marcel that night were not trained intelligence officers. They were a baker, 2 farmers, a former school teacher, and a garage mechanic who had taken on the leadership of the cell almost by accident because he was the one with a hidden radio set. What they had, instead of proper procedure, was a scrap of information passed along by a runner from the neighboring cell. That under interrogation, one of the 3 men arrested 11 days earlier had allegedly named the boy on the bicycle who comes from Maysac way as the person who had told the Germans about a weapons drop. It is worth pausing on how thin that thread actually was. Nobody in the barn had heard this directly from the arrested man. It had passed through at least 2 intermediaries, each of whom might have added, altered, or simply misremembered a detail under the pressure of their own fear. And crucially, it described not a name, but a description, the boy on the bicycle, that could plausibly have applied to at least 2 or 3 young couriers working different cells in the same stretch of countryside. What ultimately happened in that barn illustrates both how fragile and how occasionally self-correcting this system could be. The garage mechanic leading the interrogation, the closest thing the cell had to a disciplined operator, thanks to 2 brief training sessions with an SOE liaison officer the previous summer, refused to let the questioning proceed on the rumor alone. He insisted, over the visible impatience of at least one of the other men, on sending a runner that same night to the neighboring cell to ask a single, specific verifying question. What recognition phrase had the boy used when he delivered his most recent message? It was a detail that only the genuine courier and the cell leader who had issued it would know. Precisely the kind of cutout safeguard the SOE training had tried to instill. Marcel, exhausted, frightened, and by his own later account convinced he was going to die in that barn before sunrise, gave the correct phrase without hesitation. The runner returned a little after 2 in the morning with confirmation that the description that had been passed along matched Marcel only in the vaguest terms, and the arrested man, when the question had actually been put to him directly rather than through a chain of retellings, had in fact named someone else, an informer walking a different route entirely, who was, within days, dealt with by another cell. Marcel was untied. He was, by every account that survives of nights like this one, given nothing so simple as an apology. The leader of the cell reportedly told him only to go home and come back when he was needed. There was no time in that war for anything more than that. If you're finding this story useful, a quick subscribe helps this channel more than you might think. It costs nothing, and it means a great deal. It's worth setting this story against how other resistance and intelligence networks handled the same underlying problem, because the contrast is instructive. The German Abwehr and the Gestapo, running their own networks of informers inside occupied France, dealt with suspected double-dealing in an entirely different register, with paperwork, with formal interrogation transcripts, and with the brutal but methodical resources of a state security apparatus that could afford to take days or weeks establishing a case before acting on it. That apparatus was, of course, monstrous in its own way. Its interrogation methods were built on torture, not verification. But its scale and resourcing meant it rarely had to make split-second decisions about a single suspect's fate on the strength of a single second-hand rumor. At the other end of the scale, the more established SOE-run circuits, particularly those with a longer-serving British-trained radio operator attached, generally fared better at avoiding exactly this kind of internal catastrophe, for a simple structural reason. They had slightly more robust cutout procedures and, crucially, a wireless link back to London that could sometimes be used to cross-check a suspect's story against information the circuit leader in Britain already held. A rural Maquis cell like the one Marcel worked with had no such luxury. It had a single radio, shared across several cells, used sparingly to avoid German direction-finding vans, and no ability whatsoever to check anything in real time. The gap between a well-resourced SOE circuit in a major city and an isolated rural Maquis group was, in this narrow but crucial respect, often the gap between life and death for a wrongly accused courier. American-supplied Jedburgh teams, parachuted into France from the summer of 1944 onward to coordinate resistance activity ahead of and after the Normandy landings, brought with them a further layer of formal counterintelligence procedure, including standardized recognition signals shared across multiple linked cells rather than just within a single group. It is a reasonable inference, though not one that can be stated with certainty from surviving records, that had such standardized cross-cell verification existed a few months earlier in the couriers, the rumor that nearly cost Marcel his life might never have gained enough traction to reach a barn interrogation in the first place. The tightening of these procedures through 1944, in other words, was in part a direct response to exactly the kind of near-catastrophic failure his story represents, even if no single surviving document draws that line explicitly. What actually endures from stories like this one is not a medal or a monument, because there is very rarely one to give. Marcel, in this account, received no citation, no mention in dispatches, no plaque. He simply went back to cycling the roads around Meisac, carrying folded paper sewn into his jacket lining for another 5 months, until the Germans withdrew from the region in the late summer of 1944. What he represents, instead, is something the official histories of the resistance tend to underplay: the sheer contingency of survival for the thousands of ordinary people, many of them barely more than children, who did this work without training, without proper procedure, and without any guarantee that the people on their own side would get it right when it mattered most. The psychological toll of this particular danger, the danger from within rather than from the occupying army, is almost impossible to overstate and almost entirely absent from the popular memory of the resistance. Post-war testimony gathered from surviving couriers decades after the events they describe repeatedly touches on this specific fear. Not the fear of a German checkpoint, which was at least a known and countable risk, but the fear of a rumor, spoken in a language of suspicion, that had no appeal process and no burden of proof. That fear shaped how networks operated for the rest of the war, pushing many toward exactly the kind of cross-checking procedure that saved Marcel, almost by accident, on a wet night in March. There is a particular cruelty in how thoroughly this danger has been written out of the popular story of the resistance. The version most often told, in books and films alike, casts the occupation as a clean contest between occupier and occupied, between a uniformed enemy and a shadow army of the righteous. That version has its uses. It is not, strictly speaking, false. But it leaves almost no room for the far messier reality that men and women who had risked everything to fight the Germans sometimes turned, in a moment of panic and imperfect information, on each other. Acknowledging that fact does not diminish what the resistance achieved. If anything, it sharpens it, because it means the men in that barn were not choosing between courage and cowardice in some simple sense. They were choosing, in the space of a few freezing hours, between two competing forms of loyalty to the same cause: the instinct to protect the network by eliminating a possible traitor, and the discipline to protect it instead by insisting on proof.
If there is a physical trace of any of this left to see today, it is not a museum piece, but the landscape itself. The back roads of the couriers, still narrow, still winding through the same stone villages, along which a great many nameless boys and girls once carried the war's most dangerous secrets folded into the linings of ordinary clothes. A handful of regional resistance museums in the Limousin area hold recognition code notebooks, forged identity papers, and courier bicycles of the period. Unremarkable objects that carried extraordinary risk, though none can be tied definitively to any single documented case matching this one. Return for a moment to that barn. The lamp is guttering. The rain has not let up. 5 frightened, ordinary men are holding the fate of a 16-year-old boy in their hands, on the strength of a rumor that has already passed through 2 mouths before it reached theirs. There is no judge in that barn. There is no higher court to appeal to. There is only a mechanic with 2 afternoons of borrowed training, deciding, against the visible impatience of the men around him, to ask one more question before anyone reaches for the gun in the corner. That single decision, to verify before condemning, to insist on a fact rather than settle for a fear, is, in miniature, the entire difference between a resistance network that survived the war with its integrity intact and one that consumed itself from the inside, the way the enemy so often hoped it would. It changed nothing about the wider war. No bridge was blown, no convoy ambushed, no message decoded.
and yet it may have been one of the most important 5 minutes of that entire cell's existence, because it proved, on the night it mattered most, that they were still capable of telling the difference between an enemy and one of their own. Marcel was not shot. He was not the last young courier in occupied France to be accused on the strength of a rumor passed hand to hand through frightened men in the dark, and not every one of those stories ended the way his did. That, in the end, is the whole of what this story has to offer. Not a triumph, not really, but a single close call in a single cold barn that could so easily have gone the other way, and on countless other nights, in countless other barns across occupied Europe, very often did.